I'm Catherine Sharbaugh, Director of Donor Relations here at the FIA, and I want to welcome all of you to the 51st Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture. Tonight, Tracee Glab is going to present on a very provocative topic called Beautiful Death. It's Tracee's second Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture. She previously spoke about mosaics from Israel. The Sheppy Dog Lecture Fund was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein. Alan is not with us tonight, but I know we all want to thank him for sponsoring the series, and he will be watching it online later. So if you'd like to send your sound appreciation. And the next Sheppy Dog lecture will be Wednesday. Is this right, Tracee? November 9th? Yes. Oh, so we're going on a little hiatus until the fall. And James Tabor will present The Search for the Lost Shapira Dead Sea Scroll. Was it genuine or modern forgery? So before I bring Tracee up onto the stage, I want you to know that the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage provides free entry to the FIA every day if you live in Genesee County. And we really appreciate that support and thank you for voting for that. I want to remind you to silence your phones or any electronic devices that you have brought with you. So Tracee attended Wayne State University. She received her master's in art history there. And prior to that, she received her BA in art history from the University of Michigan, Dearborn. She worked at the DIA for many years, editing several museum catalogs and several collection catalogs, as well as serving as editor of the museum's scholarly journal. You probably all know that Tracee has worked at the FIA for about 13 years as our curator of collections and exhibitions. But tonight, everything is different because tonight I'm going to introduce Tracee Glab as our new executive director here at the Flint Institute of Arts.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you all for that very nice greeting. I appreciate that. I'll give you a second to get all turned on here. There we go. And the slides will come up in a minute. Fantastic. Good evening. Can everyone hear me back there? Yeah, everyone's good. All right, good. I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled to be the next director of the Flint Institute of Arts. I love this place, and I look forward to working with all of you. And I will tell you that this talk was planned over a year ago, so I didn't know that this was going to happen. Maybe I would have called the talk a different title, or maybe It's a Wonderful Life would have been a better way to have my first talk as executive director. But the funny thing is, and I want to thank Dr. Alan Klein, who's the advisor for the Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture Series, because it's really thanks to him that I even contemplated this talk. He said he wanted me to do something on the permanent collection. And, you know, it's hard just to pick one object when there's so many great objects from our 9,500 object collection. And he said, well, you know, something interesting, like, you know, when you and Catherine talk about the Fowler children portrait, that's kind of interesting. I like to hear about that, and you will hear about it in tonight's talk. But I was like, okay, you know, and then I started to think about the theme of death, because in a lot of our works in the collection, there's the theme of death. And I said, well, you know, that's maybe not such a popular subject, you know, and because we were having this conversation last year. And he said, oh, you know, if it's just me in the audience, I don't care. Of course, he couldn't be here tonight, but he's here in spirit because he's going to be watching this video. But I want to thank you, Dr. Klein, for giving me the inspiration and the go-ahead to just go ahead and have fun with a difficult subject. So when I was thinking of these different ideas in July 2021, we were in the midst of the second wave, or maybe it was the third, I can't keep track, of the COVID virus with the Delta variant. And this image is from the front page of the New York Times in May 2020 that shows the deaths in the United States. All of the black dots represent the 1 million death count. So the pandemic and death was certainly on my mind, as it was on many of you all's mind. And I started to think about the ways that artists have dealt with death through their art. And it turns out there are many connections with art and death in the FIA's collection. Some are obvious and some require a little bit of explanation. So before I get into my deep dive of my talk, I'm going to just go over a few things. One of the oldest works in our collection deal with death. This is a Chinese Neolithic vessel dating from about 4,600 years ago. Vessels like these were made to be buried with the dead and be used in the afterlife, because the belief was that death was not the end, but simply a transition into another plane of existence. So these would have been buried with the dead. One of our very most recent works that we just purchased with funds from the community gala is a work by Louisiana artist Keith Duncan called The Funeral Repass, and it's all about the family gathering both inside the house and outside the house of a funeral. So up here you see the church and the hearse. So it's the aftermath or the funeral meal and gathering of family members. So this is one of the most recent works we just purchased this year. Other works in the collection deal with causes of death, such as this work, whether it's illness, accident, or natural causes, as depicted in this deathbed scene of by an anonymous artist of an anonymous, or at least unnamed, saint. Some works show the effects of a long battle in life resulting in death, such as this glass sculpture by Clifford Rainey titled Counting, which he made in response to a friend's death by breast cancer, carving lines. It's hard to see because this is a dark sculpture, but when you see it in the galleries, you can see there's lines carved on the sculpture to mark or count the days she lived after her diagnosis. And you can see how one of the breasts was removed due to the cancer. Some artworks deal with death outside of natural causes, such as death that happens as a result of war. Sometimes this is shown in a positive light, such as this work, Judith and the Death of Holofernes. The story goes that Judith who decapitated the evil general Holofernes after she seduced him with drink. Holofernes was an Assyrian general who was warring against the Israelites. In the Deuterocanonical book of Judith, this story is recounted as a noble deed by the Hebrew widow Judith. So here she is holding his head and giving it to her servant. Other acts of war are not depicted in such a glorious light. Sophie Matisse's colorful depiction of Picasso's Guernica that you see on the screen, it was based on a work that Picasso did in 1937 that was all black and white in reaction to a bombing of a Basque village in Spain. Sophie's version was created in the aftermath of 9/11 and the World Trade Center attacks, which took place very close to her studio in downtown New York. Though its colorful treatment of the subject might suggest something positive, in fact, it's quite a work in our lobby that people love to take photos in front of. If you look at the victims, here is a dead infant, and then here are people being burned alive. You see that it's not meant to be a glorious celebration of war, but a critique. Artists have also used their medium to depict deaths in ways that are incredibly hard to look at, such as this woodcut by Matthew Owen Weed depicting the murder of George Floyd in 2020. So here you see the knee, and then here's the face. Works such as these show a harsh reality that I would characterize as necessary rather than beautiful. Artists have also not shied away from self-inflicted death, such as this tapestry panel showing the attempted suicide of Armida being stopped, the Saracen princess Armida being stopped in the nick of time by the Christian knight Rinaldo, and I don't have time to go into the story tonight, but that is, she ends up not killing herself. Artists also deal with the psychological and emotional effects of death, such as this work titled Frances, which shows the moment right before this woman dies. While it might not be obvious at first, there are clues. The tilted mirror, the roses on the nightstand or the dresser, the cracked door, and most of all, this ominous shadow that is overwhelming her and the look in her eyes. Other artists show death by depicting an absence of a person, such as this work by Shimon Ackstein of an empty ambulance stretcher. Or this American landscape painted during the Civil War of a grandfather here and a son fishing, and there's no father there. Perhaps he's at war, perhaps he has already died and will never come home again. Certainly there is no one greater than German artist Kathy Kollwitz for depicting the mother's grief over a dead child in this powerful etching. Here is the skull, the dead child, and then the mother is cradling its head, the child's head. Her work dealt with war, Kathy Kollwitz's with war, and its brutal outcomes, and was actually based on her own personal loss. This work seems to anticipate the death of her son Peter, killed on the battlefield in World War I in October 1914. And there are many more examples of death, its causes, outcomes, and reactions in the FIA collection, but I don't want to give a talk just on death as a subject in and of itself. I really wanted to focus on the aspect that is a unique contribution by artists, hence my title, Beautiful Death. To introduce this idea, I start with a quote from poet Wallace Stevens, "Death is the mother of beauty." The idea being that contemplation of beauty provokes an urge and desire to create beauty, whether it's literature, music, or the arts, or the visual arts. My own personal fascination with beautiful death stems from a cemetery near my childhood home in Southwest Detroit. Woodmere Cemetery on Fort Street, here's a photo of it on the left, an old postcard photo, wasn't a scary place of death to me in my young eyes. With its crenellated entrance covered by ivy, I imagined it to be a gateway to a fairy tale. Morbid as it sounds now, my friends and I would often take walks in the cemetery, though we had no relatives to visit. There I saw beautiful stone monuments, like you see on the right side of the screen here, of Detroit notables such as C.J. Whitney. And these structures inspired my imagination rather than fear. And I was later to learn that this was all very intentional. In the early 19th century, the rural cemetery movement began. Cemeteries were intentionally designed to be like a pleasant garden with wide, winding paths like you see on this. This is the plan of Woodmere Cemetery if you're looking down at it. And man-made lakes like you see on the left. This is a shot of Woodmere Cemetery in the fall. That would have carefully planted trees and shrubbery, beautiful sculptural monuments added to the ambiance, making it a place that's beautiful and regenerative rather than forbidding. What I didn't know as a child wandering through Woodmere was that this was all a very carefully planned experience. As I grew older, that exposure to beautiful death would stay with me and cause me to be interested in all the ways artists have this unique ability to transform something that could be dreadful into something beautiful. Or as Van Gogh puts it, perhaps death is not the most difficult thing. To explore this with the FIA's collection, I would like to look at 3 case studies, all paintings, 2 European, the first 2, and 1 American from 3 different time periods. They were all made for a Christian audience, and they all explore different aspects of death. We have a contemplation of death, a confrontation with death, and a commemoration of death. And I'll go into each one of those in detail. In the first example we will look at, we are told to get ready for it, a spiritual and mental preparation, urged to live a good life in light of it. In the second, death is upon us, and we cannot ignore the physical aspect of it. And the last example that we will look at, it's already happened, and we will consider how does the living deal with it. The hands of death. The first case study we will look at in the hands of death is the Vanitas Painting created by an unknown artist circa 1620. The hands of death phrase is taken from a handwritten poem in the book, which is right here. And we'll look at that later. I would be very remiss not to acknowledge my debt to R.J. Kelly, who in 2006, is he in the audience anywhere? I don't know. There you are. In 2006, he wrote a catalog and curated an exhibition at the FIA titled To Be or Not to Be. His extensive research on the subject helped me immensely, so I wanted to just give him a shout out for that. In order to better understand the painting, we have to first understand some things. What do we mean by vanitas? Vanitas comes from a phrase in the Hebrew Bible, vanitatum et omnia vanitas, which means vanity of vanity, all is vanity, from the book of Ecclesiastes. That warns us about the brevity of human life and the vanity of worldly things. Many ideas can come under this umbrella term of vanitas, including death, but it's not always exclusively about death. It's about the transitory nature of things in this world. The origin of this type of paintings began in the Dutch Golden Age. This is another example on the screen of the Vanitas painting. It began in the Dutch Golden Age, which dates between 1588 and 1672, when the Dutch Republic became the richest nation in the world. And I won't go into all the details of why that was the case, but what happened as a result of all of that wealth is people had more money to pay artists to decorate their homes, a lot more disposable income. Culture and the arts thrived at this time. Vanitas paintings in particular satisfied the demands of 2 audience groups. For Catholics, who were not in the majority in the Dutch Republic, they used these paintings as an aid to prayer because they didn't have overt Catholic imagery, such as a crucifix. That would get them into trouble with Protestant reformers. Another group that enjoyed these paintings were the reformers themselves. As Kelly notes, quote, the display of a Vanitas painting in their homes would have enhanced the devout atmosphere of the household, as family prayers and presence of the Bible did, end quote. And according to the Protestant reformer John Calvin, even in the best of health, we should have death before our eyes, so that we will not expect to remain on this earth forever, but have one foot in the air, so to speak. Our Vanitas painting is a specific type of painting known as emblematic. These are connections between the painted object that you see, like the skull here, and then the text. So this has an abundance of text here. We have it here, 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 up here, down here, a little bit of everywhere. And this kind of emblematic derived from printed sources, such as what you see on the screen here. On the left, a Pudo, right here, reads a book with a candle and hourglass next to him on the table. The script in the circle around him says, "Watch the life of mortals." And what interested me about this particular example is notice the different types of script. We have the very cursive, all caps script here, and then the same thing is going on in this painting, which I just thought that was an interesting connection. And then the one on the right is actually called Vanitas. This is kind of fun. This is a woman dyeing her hair. So this hat that she has on, she's draped her hair all around, and they would use urine to bleach their hair to make them blondes. So the quote underneath that says that I am lighter than the winds and a more empty shade. So he's basically making fun of her for pursuing this attempt at beauty that is all in vain eventually. So let's look at the Vanitas symbols in our painting. The one on the left is the most obvious one, the skull. I think we all think of death when we see a skull, but you have to sort of try to look at it without your modern eyes for a moment. The slip on the writing on the paper here says, look and pray or you will find no day of peace. And then the motto underneath the skull says, I was as you are now, you will be in the future as I am. This type of symbol is also known as Momento Mori, remember you will die. So it's a very, very specific thing. Trappist monks took this as their guiding motto and put it into practice by digging a little of their own grave every day. But one thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned just a second ago, is that it was seen as a positive symbol. Although we associate we associate skulls with goth culture, motorcycle gangs, pirate ships, and it can have all of those connotations too. In this setting, it would have been positive. The practice was recommended by the Jesuits to contemplate death because for Christians, it's not the end, but an entrance into eternal bliss. The Apostle Paul, in the first letter of Corinthians, writes, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Two examples in the painting of paintings and other, not Vanitas, but other types of paintings, show how the skull was to be used by Christians. R.J. Kelly, again, has pointed out the example of Jerome, a 4th century priest and theologian. The use of his skull, can you see it right there? Makes him more than just a scholar who translated the Bible into Latin. He's now a mystical hermit, and he's even being visited by an angel. Whereas in the hands of Mary Magdalene, the female follower of Jesus, the skull also elevates her into a poster child of Christian repentance. Rather than focusing on her life of wealth and ease before she converted to Christianity, images of her with a skull, here she is holding it right here, this is a work from the FIA collection, suggest a penitent woman who has been transformed by her faith. According to Kelly, quote, a Vanitas painting of a skull is intended to bring about a similar change in the viewer. Next to the skull is a vase of flowers, prominently showing the famous Dutch tulip, red with white stripes. The text above it reads, as the beauty of the flower does not last long, a person also quickly fades. And notice how the petals of the flower are already fallen off here. This reminds us that while we enjoy the beauty of flowers, they are already dying, not unlike us. The book in the center contains handwritten verses. O human being, you are a wandering guest on earth. Flesh is the hay of the Lord, like a garden flower, which by cultivation reaches a higher level of quality. As a lit candle has to burn, so a man once born must fall into the hands of death. Books and Vanitas paintings show that acquiring human knowledge is also a vain pursuit. What good will it do us in the grave? But here, because of the poetry, I think it has an additional meaning. While there was precedent for having verses to explain the meaning of the Vanitas images, just like I showed you, I think this work is an overkill with all of the text. The quill pen, right here in case, implies that the setting is that of a writer, and not just any writer, but a poet, who's showing us his verses in the book, which reminded me of a verse in Ecclesiastes, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for in the realm of the dead, where you are going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. The added implements of the hourglass and sundial, both about time, and the candle that is almost to go out, further reinforce the Vanitas message. Above the hourglass are the words, time runs fast, all youthful grace will vanish before one is aware of it. So imagine you are this poet, my imagined recipient of the painting, and maybe even a commissioner of the painting, and you look at this work every day before you start to put quill pen to paper. Wouldn't your verses, like our poet Wallace Stevens said at the beginning, be all the more beautiful? According to Harold Schechter, author of the Whole Death Catalog, quote, humans, particularly as we grow older, are all too keenly aware of how fleeting life is. On the plus side, this can add flavor and poignancy to our existence, making us savor the lovely and precious things in life. What better way to compose your verses, and thus your life, being in the hands of death? So now we'll look at the face of death. We've contemplated death in the midst of life. We are going to come face to face with the actual moment. Created 160 years after the Vanitas painting we just looked at, in 1787, Francisco Goya's The Death of Saint Joseph refers back to a practice in art that began in the Middle Ages, ars moriendi, the art of dying. The term refers to the crucial moment in one's life when you prepare to leave it. It was the subject of numerous books and essays intending us to help us better cope with death. It was intended for priests and the faithful, suggesting how we face our most common fears: going to hell, losing one's worldly possessions, having insufficient faith, being unable to bear pain and suffering. So in this case, this is the full painting that's in the National Gallery of Art, but then I show you a detail here. It's a miser. And so it's called Death and the Miser. So he has a lot to be worried about because he's basically wants to hold on to his money right until the very end. And here you have this little gremlin, demon thing here grabbing his money bag. And here's the angel trying to point him up to to heaven. Here's the Grim Reaper about to finish the deed. So this is a very typical example of the ars moriendi. But in the case of Saint Joseph, it goes one step further, which is ars bene moriendi, the art of dying well. So before I get into what that means, I want to take a little bit more closer look on what we're looking at with this painting. The work depicts a rarely depicted subject in the history of art, the death of Saint Joseph. Jesus Christ is right here at the deathbed of his adopted father Joseph, with his mother Mary in the background. The subject is rare for a lot of reasons. Nowhere in Scripture does it say when, where, or how Joseph dies. Joseph, as the adopted father of Jesus, is traditionally a background figure because Jesus' true father is God. In images of the Holy Family, Joseph is often shown set apart in the shadows or otherwise occupied. The apocryphal book, The History of Joseph the Carpenter, describes how he died aged 111 in the presence of Christ and the Virgin, with angels descending from heaven. Now, this work is a sketch by Goya, and it's very, very wonderful that we have it here in the collection, not only because it's a work by Goya, who's a very important artist, but it also really gives you an insight into how an artist worked at this time. And you can even see the markings of his sketch throughout, which just shows that really raw creativity of the artist. Goya he's the only artist we actually know of the work, so I wanted to spend a little time with him. This is a self-portrait he did when he was around 40 years old. And at the time in Spain, at this time that he painted this self-portrait, he was appointed painter to King Charles III and later court painter to his son, Charles IV. He was commissioned. Now, his works can be broken up into two categories, either commissions or things that he did on his own that he liked. This particular work was a commission, and it was for a convent of St. Anna in Valladolid. And so this is the interior of the chapel here. And we're going to be looking at, and so he created all of the side panel paintings for this chapel. But our particular work is just the sketch. Here's the finished version. So this is what it looks like in the chapel with this elaborate frame all around it. And then this is a better look of the finished work. So obviously, there's a lot of changes between ours and the finished work. Here's an example of them side by side. Obviously, our sketch is much smaller than the original, but you can see where he's made changes. He's eliminated the cherubs, and that's possibly because in this work, they are up here on the sculpture part. But also, he has sort of removed Jesus from the bedside in making him more walking into the room. Here, I think it's much more intimate. He's holding his hand. They're very close together. And even in this one, he sort of added the halo effect of this ray of light behind his head. So why did he make this change? And most often than not, the answer is the person commissioning it told him to make the change. He was working for a patron after all. But I also wonder why it was rejected. And I think maybe because the one on the left in our collection is much more intimate. According to Liz Leff in her book, How Catholic Art Saved the Faith, quote, "The Catholic definition of a good life lay in a good death. To render less fearful the end of bodily life, the arts were constantly called into service. In painting, the Catholic Restoration represented the death of St. Joseph as the ideal end for Christian men and women. St. Joseph illustrates the most peaceful passing in human history." So here it is again, and I just saw this screenshot. I'm not playing this video for you, but someone used our image, I don't think with permission, for a video on why St. Joseph is the patron saint during a pandemic. So I just thought that was interesting that they used a detail of our painting for that reason. Both Jesus and Mary is at the side of Joseph during his good death. In his seminal work, Now at the Hour of Our Death, Philippe Ariès writes, quote, "Ever since the risen Christ triumphed over death, the fact of being born into this world is the real death. And physical death is access to eternal life. Thus the Christian is urged to look forward to death with joy, as if to a new birth." End quote. If you take away the cherubs, it might be any deathbed scene of a parent and adult child. Before our modern age and sterile hospitals and hospice centers, most people died at home, often in their own beds, with friends and family at the bedside or close by. Perhaps it was Goya's personal experience that helped him create such a moving depiction. Throughout his life, he was plagued by illness, something that other artists used against him, but he claimed that those experiences allowed him to create more personal and emotionally touching works, which is certainly the case here. So we've looked at the hands of death and how contemplating our mortality may make us more creative, productive, then the face of death, whereby confronting it will make us less afraid and, in fact, bring some comfort. Now we turn to the shadow of death, whereby death has already happened, and what does the living do about it? This next painting was created 67 years after Goya's in 1854. Whether or not the painting is dealing with the subject of death is immediately difficult because the family lore, the people who gave us this work, state that all 3 Fowler children, depicted here, survived into adulthood. Or did they? This is the question I would like to investigate with you and then let you decide for yourselves. Before we get into the subject of the portrait, let's first talk about what was going on in American portraiture during the early 19th century. To appreciate what was going on, you first need to understand that people of that time period were much more familiar and much more exposed to death than we are. Yes, we see death in the news and in popular culture way more than we would like, but their intimacy was on a totally different level. They watched family members die in their homes, not hospitals. Funerals were in the home's parlor, not in a funeral home. Severe mortality rates at this time, especially among infants and women, were very high. One reaction to this whole, and I just show you on the screen an example a mourning portrait with the monument and family surrounding it from another collection. So one reaction to this became a whole culture of dealing with death, from grave monuments, as we just saw in that previous image, to mourning clothes. This is a fashion plate of from a catalog advertising all the different accessories that you could have for mourning wear, to jewelry made of hair. So this is all made from someone's human hair, and it's braided here, so that's not thread. And then inside, in the actual ornament would have also been made of hair. And I've also seen, besides jewelry, I've seen lots of other works of art that would be hung on the wall. And then, of course, that beautiful cemetery movement that I talked about at the beginning of my talk was in the 19th century. This was something that also, this was the time also when something known as posthumous portraiture bloomed and thrived. In one sense, all portraiture is a record of the dead because eventually they die, but this particular type of portraiture was created to make pictures of people who had died, either depicting them in death, like the example that you see on the screen here of a dead infant, or portraying them as still alive. This was particularly true for portraits of deceased children, which were 20 times higher than the number of deceased adults. In fact, artists often charged even double the price for a, quote, likeness after death. For example, one artist charged $20 for a regular portrait, $50 for a posthumous portrait. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge a book on this subject, Securing the Shadow by Stacy Hollander and Gary Laderman, which was published in conjunction with the exhibition of the same name at the Folk Art Museum. Believe it or not, there isn't a lot of information on the subject of death in art, so this resource was very helpful to me. In this book, Hollander writes that the dead were held in individual memories, but posthumous portraits allowed those memories to be shared. The success of the portrait relied on a certain willingness to suspend belief and on a knowledge of a formal symbolic lexicon, end quote. So that formal symbolic lexicon is what I would like to go more in depth with you right now, because it brings us back to the portrait of the Fowler children. But before we get there, we're going to talk about it in other works in the FIA's collection. So just like that Vanitas painting we looked at a few minutes ago that had certain symbols that all related to the brevity of life or contemplating death, like skulls, flowers, books, hourglass, just as those communicated meaning to the viewer that would have been immediately understood, so too was the case in the 19th century. On the screen here, we have this very sweet portrait of a young girl, and at first glance, it does not immediately suggest death. There are no skulls or hourglass or even angels flying around. But notice that she's holding a bloomed rose with rosebuds here, and then there's a rose bush behind her. Roses are associated with the Virgin Mary, who is called a rose without thorns, that is, sinless. Depictions of roses with people who are not the Virgin Mary indicate both innocence and a special means of grace. Also, in the symbol lexicon of posthumous portraiture, roses are rosebuds standing for youth in blossom from a growing rosebush meant a young life ended too soon. So this is the case with Hannah Gregory. I actually found an image of her tombstone online. The internet does wonders for research, because I found her marker where she died aged 3 or 4 in 1842. Also, she wears white, the symbol of purity and innocence, a further indication of a child who died too soon. And another example from our collection, Gracie Beardsley Jefferson Jackman, that's a mouthful, and her daughter. The girl is wearing white, there she is, the little girl, and holding a drooping rose. And I want us to pause and consider what's going on here. If this is a posthumous portrait of the child, and I believe it is, this is an example from our collection of showing the dead as if she were still alive. by putting the child in the same plane as the living mother. Only the symbols tell us that something's different. The child also wears a coral necklace. In practical terms, coral necklaces were put on infants as because it was believed to ward off evil. Coral was supposed to protect children from illnesses like stomach aches, typhus, and smallpox as well. It also was believed to ward off the evil eye. But with every common practice, meaning often starts to be associated with it. And because coral, this here, consists of skeletons of invertebrates that once lived, it became associated with death. Another common symbol in posthumous portraits is not actually relevant to the Fowler children, but I wanted to share it here anyway, is that of the child with one shoe off. Some scholars trace this to the venerated Byzantine icon, Our Lady of Perpetual Help, where the infant Jesus is shown in his mother's lap with a sandal dangling off his left foot. But like all symbols, sometimes they have more than one meaning. For portraits of children with one shoe off that were often proved to live past infancy, the shoe off could mean a transition from infancy to being a toddler. They're changing their shoes. But in this example from the National Gallery, which is also a painting given to the same collectors that gave us most of our early American art, Edgar and Bernice Chrysler Garbish, here's a child with the one shoe off, and then it's shown, a researcher found this daguerreotype with the mother and the portrait in other words, she's using the portrait as a stand-in for her child that is now gone. She probably never had a chance to actually have a photo taken with the child while it was alive. And it's reversed because photography at this time reversed the image. Now that we've looked at some common symbols, let's return to the Fowler children. I stated at the beginning that there's a problem with calling this a posthumous portrait, since family lore indicates that all children, all three of them, survived into adulthood. Yet based on what we've learned about the symbols, white dress, coral necklace, roses, rose bush, rosebuds, and then there's also further clues, which I'll get into in a minute. But before I do, just a quick little history lesson about this painting. It came to us through the heir of this person pictured here. This is Delia, Milo, and Gertrude Fowler. An older daughter named Caroline is not depicted because she had already moved out of the house. It was painted in 1854 in Clayton, New York, for the Fowler family who were in the shipping business. And it was done by a Philadelphia painter, we don't know his name, who traveled to New York. We do know, according to family records, that they paid $300. Now, I don't know if you remember a few paragraphs ago, I said that a $50 portrait was the going price. So that they paid $300 makes me wonder about whether it was posthumous or not, just another clue. That's about $12,000 in today's money. How did the painting make its way to Flint? The Fowler family, moved to Detroit in 1856, just 2 years after this painting was completed. In 1859, Delia here married Sidney Tucker, and they moved to Flushing. In 1871, they made their way to Flint, and in 1879, her father died, and she inherits the painting. It then stays in Flint and is inherited by her granddaughter, Adelaide, who gives the work to the FIA in 1976. And what we know, everything we know about the painting comes from Adelaide. So a handwritten manuscript is in the file, including the fact that Gertrude survives infancy. So a couple of the other symbols that we haven't talked about is that Delia and Milo are separated by this ivy trellis backdrop, whereas Gertrude is kneeling on the ground and she is surrounded by this beautiful landscape with waterfalls and trees and just beautiful setting. Could she be in front of a heavenly landscape? She also holds a book, which refers back to that other Vanitas symbol that we saw earlier, possibly an illustrated children's Bible that were being published at the time. And so the separation between her siblings and her sort of again, makes it another, are they in two different planes? And this is something that was used in posthumous portraiture as well. Here's a work by Oliver Tarbell Eddy showing the deceased child on the left who's separated from the other siblings, but yet they're in the same portrait and they're in the same plane, but there is a little bit of separation there. Another piece of evidence is the presence of a horse, a person riding on horseback right here. And that, I think, is John Fowler's brother, Melzer, who died at the age of 32 in 1835. So about 20 years before this was painted. He was fatally injured by the kick of his own horse. Could this be the uncle back there? And I have Catherine Sharbaugh to thank for calling my attention to all the death symbols in this portrait. Together, we have talked about all the possibilities of what is going on here, given the contradictory evidence of Adelaide. So for this talk, I wanted to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes. In 2020, I was approached by a Fowler heir, Henry and Julie Livingston, who wanted to donate portraits of John Nash and Delia Scott Fowler to the FIA, and here they are. So they are now on view in the galleries all together, a big family reunion. But I asked him, because he was really into genealogy, was there ever a dead Gertrude? Because one of the theories we had was maybe there was two Gertrudes, and then one of them survived, but the other one died. And that was often common to give a sibling's name on to the next person who was born. And he said, yes, they did have a daughter who died. Puella S. Fowler died in October 1836, and she's buried in Clayton. Here is her grave marker. It's kind of hard to read, but there's a symbol of a weeping willow here, and then it says Puella S. on there. Puella is Latin for girl, and could have been a sign that the infant died before given another name. But then there's still the problem of Gertrude. If she's alive, why show her with symbols of the dead? I was able to verify that she did die in 1907 in California. Her full name is Clarissa Gertrude Fowler. She was named after her dead aunt, Clarissa, the woman who was married to Meltzer, the guy riding the horse who was kicked by his horse. Gertrude was born in 1846, so she would have been around 8 years old at the time of the painting. Furthermore, I found census data that would seem to support the family narrative. But there is some mystery introduced, which we could just chalk up to a clerical error. In the 1850 census, she's Gertrude A., age 5. She should be only 4, but okay, could just be an error. And then here is the 1855 census, which was a year after her, after the painting, and she's now C. Gertrude Fowler, age 9. So she's the right age in the 1855 census, but her name has been changed from Gertrude A. to C. Gertrude. It's not a smoking gun, I know, but it just adds to the mystery of this whole thing. But then another thing happened. As I was looking at the Find a Grave page on Puella S. Fowler, I noticed this other grave marker here that was posted. And I was like, that's weird. Why is it looks totally different? You know, maybe there's another grave there. So I again, the wonders of the internet, I sent a message to the woman who took this photo. Her name is Sandra Ferrotino, and she actually went to the cemetery for me, and she tried to get a grave robbing, but it didn't work out. She said it was way too rubbed off, but she could confirm that it was another Puella, and that but that she couldn't make out the date, that it was either 1829 or 1889. And I was like, well, it can't be later than when they left Clayton, because they left Clayton in the 1850s. So maybe it's another Puella who died in 1829, but we just don't know for sure. And of course, when I tried to find the birth records for this area in New York State, they weren't required to report anything until 1880, so they just don't exist. And you know, Catherine and I say we often go to Clayton one day to try to dig it up ourselves, but I don't know if we'll ever do that. But regardless of what we don't know, we do know the Fowler family suffered much loss in the 1830s and 40s. Puella S. died in 1836, possibly another daughter before or after. They lost John's brother Melzer to a tragic accident in 1835, and Melzer's wife Clarissa, who Gertrude is named after, died in 1842. According to, and again, this is just another mystery on top of all of the mysteries, but I'm putting it out there for your consideration. Another thing to think about is that in 1848, it was the beginning of the Spiritualist movement in Hydesville, New York, not too far from Clayton. The movement was based on the belief that departed souls can interact with the living. On the right is a seance, and on the left are the Fox sisters, Kate and Maggie, who claimed to communicate with the dead through a series of raps on the walls and furniture. Later on, their claims ended up being shown false, but it didn't really matter. It launched this whole movement that would last into the early 20th century and World War I, where such notables as Arthur Conan Doyle became believers. Now, spiritualism and art is a whole other subject of a talk, which I won't do tonight. I just want to bring it up here as something else to consider in terms of these symbols in the Fowler portrait. Could Gertrude, though alive, have been some kind of medium to those relatives who passed over? Don't know. But I think it's only fitting that I end my talk with a mystery. After all, none of us, not even artists, can truly tell us what happens next. With these 3 case studies, we have seen how the contemplation, confrontation, and commemoration of death is aimed at the living. We can live a better life by considering how time is short. We don't have to be afraid of death because we are not alone. And we can keep inventing ways to keep the dead alive with us. Thank you.